So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for our introduction to anti-racism training. I will pass off the mic to the Elmwood team, but first I'll just do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Jessica Prasnik. I'm one of the project managers at Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. Immigration Partnership Winnipeg is a local immigration partnership, and we're really dedicated to making Winnipeg a more welcoming, inclusive city, not only for newcomers, but all Winnipeggers. And I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that us organizers of this training are located on Treaty 1 territory. This is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. What that means to me is that I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land, especially as we discuss racism in this training and in our community. We must understand, recognize, and address the historical and ongoing impact of colonization. So I just want to start with a bit of Zoom webinar etiquette. And so if you have questions, there is, I believe there should be a Q&A section. So you can submit your questions through that Q&A box. And there is also a chat box. So you're welcome to put some information in there. But this training is a safe space. So if we find any racist or discriminatory comments, we will take them down, and you will be asked to leave, as we do want to ensure that this training continues to be safe for everybody who's attending. I just want to give a big thank you to Becky Lake from MANSO, who's helping us right now manage all of the chat questions. I see a bunch of comments coming up, so thank you so much, Becky. We all really thank you here from the team putting on this training. And I want to thank you for your help with the technical support. So before we get into our training, I just wanted to introduce our speakers today. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, everyone. All right. So, and I really want to start by saying that this training has been all of I guess I want to start by giving a big thank you to the Elmwood team. This training has really been put on by them. They've done all of the hard work, all of the information sharing is coming from them, and they're just a fantastic group of folks. So all of the thanks really goes to them. So we have 3 speakers from Elmwood Community Resource Centre who will be doing the training today. So Nina Kondo is a Black Canadian, a mother of 2 boys. Her background is mental health and social work. She's the executive director of Elmwood Community Resource Centre. Under Nina's leadership, the ECRC has received many awards in recognition of its work in the community, most recently a public recognition by the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba. Nina serves as the board of directors for the Manitoba Association of Newcomer Serving Organizations, the Chalmers Neighborhood Renewal Corporation, as well as a chair of the Inclusion and Civic Engagement Sector Table for Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. She's serving on the National Gender-Based Violence Strategy, representing the Canadian Immigrant Settlement Sector Association, and MANSO, an initiative of Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada. Nina is passionate about community development, advocacy, and empowering individual families. Her philosophy is it takes a community to build, raise, and heal families while supporting the growth, liberation for everyone. Then we have Laura Barker. She is a registered social worker who's been working with individuals and families facing a variety of challenges since 2011. She uses a multi-model and strength-based approach to empowering clients towards health and well-being. Lauren has received her Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Calgary and is currently in the process of obtaining her Master's of Social Work degree from the University of Manitoba. Lauren has extensive experience in the field of crisis intervention and is currently managing the Women's Awakening program at Elmwood Community Resource Centre, where she provides group and individual counseling to individuals who struggle with trauma and domestic violence. Lauren believes that wisdom, growth, and healing emerge when individuals are provided with a safe and affirming relationship in which to explore personal challenges. The third speaker we have is Tamika. She's a registered social worker from the University of Manitoba. She currently works at Elmwood Community Resource Centre as a community research and outreach coordinator. Within this position, Tamika is the first point of contact for many counseling requests as she conducts the intakes. She also focuses on research and developing best practices approach to topics such as anti-racism and inclusivity within the Elmwood Community Resource Centre. So thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, and I will pass it off to them.
Hey, Jess and Nina, it's Becky. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I wonder if we can just add one more thing to the logistics. I've had a few questions from people about whether there is a plan to share the recording after the webinar. And then maybe also if you'd like people to use just the Q&A function, or if you want people to be able to raise their hands as well.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, sorry, I should have, both details I should have provided. So I really apologize for that. We are currently recording the webinar, and we will share we'll share the webinar after the training. We'll just have to, it'll go up on both of our websites, so Immigration Partnership Winnipeg and Elmwood Community Resource Centre, likely shared through YouTube. So yeah, keep an eye on for that, because I know some people have to leave early, so please do look out for that. As well, if you could submit your questions to the Q&A box, the training, we're anticipating for it to go from now until 7, and then we've allocated about a half an hour at the end to answer all your questions. So we're going to go straight through with the training, and then at the end we'll plan to answer those questions. So please submit all of your questions through the Q&A box, and then we will get to it at the end of the training. And if we don't have time in that half an hour to answer all of your questions, we will incorporate trying to answer them in our second part of this training, which is on June 25th, how to be being an effective ally. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Becky. So I'm gonna pass on the baton to the Elmwood team. Nina, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Hello, everybody. I'm Nina. I'm the Executive Director of Elmwood Community Resource Centre, and welcome to the anti-racism training. This is going to be a thought-provoking training, but also I will ask people to sit with the uncomfortableness and some of the topic that we're discussing will bring up some wonders, and if you can reflect on it, and then at the end we'll be asking you some poll question and some call to action as well. So Elmwood Community Resource Centre is a non-profit organization located in Elmwood. It's been around since 2001. We do offer services for families, so children, youth, and adults, and that include counseling program to adult literacy to employment programming, as well as Indigenous parenting program and newcomer program, as well as recreational activity program and summer programming. So we offer around 10 to 15 programming consistently and concurrently. So I invite you to go to our website and learn more about the services that we do, but also we do all the work in partnership with all of you. We have amazing local partner here in Elmwood, and as well as I want to acknowledge Jessica for doing all the work behind the scene and for bringing all of us here together, and as well as Becky from MESO for helping us with the technical challenges that we were having before. And I want to acknowledge my team as well, Tamika and Lauren, who have done the legwork of putting this training together, but also acknowledging how emotional, impacting, and draining that this training is also causing, not only on the participant, but also on the speakers themselves. There we go. All right, so what is race? Race is a social construct, and it was created by human in certain historical and material condition. It's used to represent a world in certain ways under certain historical condition for certain political interests. But also it's social contracts because it implies that it can vary, it can change, it's very fluid. Robert Mall defined race as an idea created by human being that usually is to understand the differences that we have. Race is used in specific historical context in which it operates, but also it highlights that it's important not to assume that race is inherent category that we have always existed, that we've always exist and do not change, but how racial groups are defined and mixed into one group is also another problematic about. Race is a scientific biological notion used to categorize people according to their characteristic. They're historical grouped, a wide range of people according to their region, religion, class, skin color. Although the idea of race predates scientific involvement, science helps us in casting division in appearance, as indicated in terms of your attribute. But it was until the 1999 to 1938 that the biological validity of race is being accepted as a concept. But then it became to disappear. It became to disappear with new scientific circle, where it's used as a race is a typology to explain culture phenomenon, but was largely rejected as well. So that's race. And then the next slide will take us to what is racism. So I'll just leave that slide on for a few minutes for you to ponder, contemplate, and ask yourself where racism starts. How do we become racist? So Dorothy and Wendy define racism to be the product of racial attitude and belief that are endured through social life. Like racism is also a social construct phenomenon. Race is a social construct phenomenon where we attribute each other based on the characteristics that we possess, whether that's a skin color, our physical attributes, facial feature, hair color, texture, all of that, intellectual ability, sometimes our moral and sometimes culture as well. So racism can occur on all levels of our society and also throughout our social interaction. So racism can happen from an individual being spontaneously singled out for discriminatory treatment, whether that can be refusal of access to opportunities. It's a social practice connected to power, and it's also used to categorize others. There are 4 types of racism, and we'll go into it later on. And then we'll go into the next slide. Thank you. So the next slide, it talks about power, the power of invisibility. White as a non-race is most evident in the absence of reference to whiteness in the speech that we give, in the academic writing that we have. we also find that white will speak of the blackness, the brownness of their friends, neighbors, colleague, client, and it will be in a most genuinely and friendly way, but still racialized people don't have the same power or the same ability to mention the whiteness of the folks they know. So being human, just that the fact of being human, there's no more powerful position than just being that position. So Richard Dyer, I've been referencing some of the material of where you can also learn these topics a little bit further. So the claim to power is the claim to speak for the commonality of humanity. Raced people don't have that power. They can only speak from a place of their race, from a place of their own experiences, but non-raced people can, for they do not represent the interests of a race. As such, whiteness can be weaponized. For instance, we've heard it recently, Amy Cooper, who have called the police on a black male who wanted just to protect a bird that he was mostly wanting Amy to leash her dog. So that whiteness can be weaponized in a negative way, but also it can be used as a powerful way to drive change that will be positively impacting everyone. So to the next slide, it goes on to talk about white privilege. White privilege is defined as unquestionable or unearned set of benefit, entitlement, and choices bestowed upon people just because they are white. Generally, white people will experience that privilege without being really conscious of it. So for example, I can go shopping alone most of the time and be sure that I will not be followed in the store. That can be a white person speaking. But me as a black female, I cannot go in a shop and be 100% sure and safe that no one will follow me around. Another privilege that white people may hold is I can go from most meeting of organization that I belong to and feel somewhat tied into rather than isolated or out of place, and also feeling heard, versus in some of the occasion where I will be invited to attend a meeting, but when I'm speaking out and sharing my perspective, my voice may not be heard. My voice will be, oh, okay, but not taken into consideration. But when I ask my colleague Lauren to speak the same message that I've passed on, that message will be accepted hearing it from Lauren. So some of those things that we do unconsciously, we need to start looking into it and stopping those behavior. Okay, the next one we'll pass on to Tamika, who will take us into a little bit of history and the root cause of racism.
Okay, so there's an idea that Canada, racism doesn't exist in Canada, but historically and currently it does. So I'm just going to go over a few of the racist events and colonism that happened in Canada historically. So in the 1600s, the first European colonists arrived in Canada. In 1619, the first shipload of enslaved Africans to reach British North America landed at Jamestown. From 1628 until 1800s, 3,000 people of African ancestry who were enslaved in the United States were brought to Canada and forced to live here in slavery. In 1776, Black loyalists arrived. The British promised freedom and rights to slaves and free Black people in exchange for service during the American Revolution. During this time, Canada developed a reputation as a safe haven for Black Americans. In 1833, 1833, slavery was abolished throughout the British colonies by an imperial act which became effective. The right to vote in provincial and municipal elections was taken away from Chinese Canadians in British Columbia. Japanese Canadians and South Asians were similarly disenfranchised in 1895 and 1907, respectively. In 1876, the Indian Act was created. In 1880, the amendment to the Indian Act formally disenfranchised and disempowered Indigenous women. In 1881, 17,000 Chinese laborers came to work on the Canadian Pacific after collecting through the head tax between racials were authorized by Sir John A. Macdonald. In 1884, Indigenous ceremonies were banned by the federal government. In 1885, the federal law barred Chinese voters from voting in federal Indigenous peoples had to pay for suited to climate or requirements of Canada or of immigrants of any specified class, occupation, or character. In 1914, 376 people from India were detained from a ship for 2 months and then denied entry into Canada. Ontario barred Chinese males from hiring white females. In 1920, the Dominion Elections Act effectively extended the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, makes attendance at residential school mandatory for every Indigenous child. In 1922, the KKK and other white nationalists became active forces in Canada. In 1929, Saskatchewan passed a law which forbade any white woman or girl from working in any restaurant, laundry, or other place of business owned by any Japanese or other Oriental person. In 1942, the Canadian government ordered all persons of Japanese racial origin to be removed from the restricted zone within 100 miles of the west coast of British Columbia. The Canadian government forced 20,000 Japanese people into the internment camps. In 1953, as a part of the Northern Sovereignty Agenda, the federal government forced settlement of 8 Inuit families to the northernmost settlement in Canada on Ellesmere Island. And these are just the last few. In 1960, as residential schools closed, thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families by provincial and federal social workers and placed in foster or adoption homes. In 1983, the last segregated school in Canada was in Nova Scotia, and in 1996, the last residential school was closed. So that's just an idea of the historic racism that has happened and occurred in Canada. Now I'm going to speak to the 4 dimensions of racism. So there's the internalized racism, there's interpersonal, there's systematic, and there's institutional. And systematic and institutional kind of relate. So internalized racism, it's a form of internalized oppression fueled by the endurance of everyday racism. Overt and covert racist messages or events that create negative beliefs and self-hatred in individuals. Internalized racism is a self-fulfilling prophecy that tells individuals they are not good enough while negatively impacting their physical and mental well-being. So the next is interpersonal racism. This kind of racism can be seen through personal attacks on racialized groups with the use of derogatory slurs, stereotypes, name-calling, physical abuse, etc. Interpersonal racism sometimes isn't as obvious, or it can be portrayed through microaggressions or thoughts. So now I'm going to go over microaggressions and what that means. So microaggressions are subtle expressions of racism that seem harmless but can cause great offense to the microaggressed. Microaggressions can be intentional or unintentional. They are coded with negative messages and stereotypes that portray the dominant group as the standard and other groups as abnormal. So I'm just going to go to the next slide with the examples. Okay. So these are just a few examples of different microaggressions. Number one is, where are you really from? This implies that you're not Canadian and you must be foreign or from somewhere else. The second is, you speak good English. That really means, who would have thought someone of your race would be so articulate? Being ignored at the counter, a store owner following the customer of color around the store, it means you are less valued or poor, might steal. The fourth one is, there is only one race, the human race. This denies the person as a racial cultural being and their societal experiences. The fifth one is university buildings named after white males, or even like streets. That means you don't belong. Someone clutching their wallet or their purse as a Black person approaches or passes, that means they're dangerous or they're poor and they might steal. The last one is, I am not racist, I have Black friends. This denies their racism and their racial bias. So the next slide is systematic racism. This refers to bias policies, practices, and culture within an organization that reinforce racist standards. Systematic racism creates disadvantages for racialized groups while advantaging non-racialized groups. Next is institutional racism. These are practices that reinforce racist standards within a workspace or organizations. They directly and deliberately prevents minorities from full and equal institutional involvement. And through the next slide, I'll be talking about the economic advantages of racism. So throughout the Canadian timeline of racism and colonization, we can see multiple events that took place that involve some sort of economic gain. Example, the Chinese head tax or the slavery of racialized groups to do labor. And European powers justify colonialism as moral obligation to modernize and civilize certain groups, but behind this justification was also the need to gain economic growth and through slavery and the extraction of natural resources. For example, by some estimates, slaveholders extracted more than 14 trillion worth of labor in today's dollars from their captives. Economic gain is still one of the major factors of racism today.
So next, I'm going to continue on what is racism, and then if you have question, you can write the question on the screen as we go. So the next one is racism and discrimination, how racism manifests. So if Jessica, you can move the slide. Thank you. So intersectionality and interconnection of race and racism. The word intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black American lady, and the term means it describes the way people's social identity can overlap. It's also a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operates together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality. We tend to talk about race inequality as a separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, and immigrant status. So it's important to acknowledge that everyday racism and the discrimination that people experience may be exacerbated based on also on their gender, on their ability, and how all of that overlap with each other. So we also need to also look at the power that they hold, their religion. If it's I am a female and I am a Muslim female, I'm a black Canadian, all of those will impact the way people will treat me, and all of those it's the overlapping and intersection of all the identity that I hold as a human being. So when we're looking at racism, we have to also consider all of those attributes that comes with it. So the next slide, it's talking about racialization and racial profiling. Do you want to click on it, Jessica, for me? So racialization and racial profiling. What is racialization? It's the process by which people are selected, they are sorted, and given attribute and assigned action based on their race again, right? So and that goes into racial profiling. It's a mindset that involves stereotyping of people based on their preconceived idea about that individual characteristics. So when you get stopped by the police, you get asked more questions based on who your physical characteristics. According to Ontario Human Rights Commission, racialization is about the process by which people are selected, sorted, given attribute, and assigned action. Social policies and practices maintain and enforce racial boundaries, power relations, and structurally embedded meanings. So these policies and practices perpetuate the racial hierarchy and can be intentional or non-intentional. The concept of race is sustained through this process, that the product of racializations. The fact that society continues to make racialized judgment in all areas of social life highlights the powerful effect and impact it has in people's life. So for example, in the context of crime and criminal justice, racialization refers to the ways in which criminal justice process and situation use the idea of race. The racialization of crime in Canada has led to racialized individual and group experiencing a range of injustice as criminal identity becomes fused with racial identity. And racial profiling is according to Ontario Human Rights Commission again, is different from criminal profiling. So racial profiling is based on stereotype, assumption, because of one's race, color, ethnicity, and sometimes also religion. Criminal profiling, on the other hand, relies on actual behavior or information about suspected activity by someone who meets the description of a specific individuals. For example, law enforcement official assumes someone is more likely to have committed a crime because he's African Canadian. Or if we take a moment and remember why we're here today, George Floyd, he was assumed that the $20 bill, $20, I just want you guys to sit down and sit with it for a second. $20 bill caused someone to lose their life. And in a way that it was very outrageous. I don't think an animal can be killed or murdered that way. So if you have $20 with you in your wallet, take it and look at yourself in a mirror. Is $20 worth your life? Worth a human being life? No. So this racial criminal profiling is deeper. It's woven within our behavior, our society, policy, and systems. And I would like us to just have 1 minute of silence to remember and honor all of those that we've lost, our brothers, our sisters, our grandparents, grandmothers, through racial profiling, through police brutality. 1 minute, and then I'll speak again after. So the next slide, thank you all. The next slide is on carding. Jessica, do you want to move on to the next slide? Thank you. So carding is another form of racial profiling where police officer stop, questions, and document individual without any evidence that they have been involved in or have knowledge of or an offense. Biases and stereotyping play in the officer's decision of who to stop and why, which affect many racialized groups. I have a perfect example. Last fall, two of my colleagues were traveling to another province to go speak on human rights and racism. And one of them is a Black male youth, well, relatively youth, between 20 and 25. And this person was stopped at the airport 2 times and was fully stripped because he fitted the racial profiling of a gang member. Just because he was Black, the way he dressed, the way he was talking, put him under that box. And can you imagine, you are going to talk about anti-racism and human rights, and you're being stopped just because of your race and because of who you are as an individual. Just sit with that for a moment. And imagine that person has to ground themselves and recollect themselves in order to go and provide that presentation in a manner that is impactful. So that way, he doesn't fall or doesn't fit again in another box of the angry Black male. So police practice of documenting the personal details of people, usually with no charge laid. In 1957 in Toronto, police were given actual cards called suspect cards to document and forward information about persons of interest to detective. Over the years, the card became a form, and later it became, or it's now called, report. So by 2015, the practice was called community engagement. By the term carding, stuck and still involve random stop of citizen and collection of personal data, including details of physical appearance, address, contact information. In 2016, Toronto police had effectively ended the practice of carding. However, there are still reports that informal carding still takes place, especially in Toronto Transit Commission vehicle and even here in Manitoba. The next slide. So racial profiling and carding often leads to police committing acts of violence. And that has been the result of now George Floyd being on the news. Unfortunately, it only doesn't affect George Floyd, but that event, that experience has affected all Black folks in the world. And they have lived that experience every day. The only difference that we're having today is that we're able to film it and broadcast it through our technology, our phone. And unfortunately, we had to see and witness somebody being murdered on the live TV or phone in order for us to take action. Black residents in Toronto are 20 times more likely to die in a police shooting than their white counterpart. Black residents in Toronto also account for 25% of police involved in shooting, when they make up only 8.8% of the population. Next slide will be on racial discrimination. So racial discrimination can often be subtle, as such assigned to less desirable jobs, being denied a mentoring position or a training. It also means facing different job standard than the other workers, or being denied an apartment because you just look different than the other person. So I'm gonna move on quickly because I'm keeping an eye on the clock as well. And then the next slide, it talks about our judicial system, where I'm calling it, it becomes the prison has become the modern slavery. And why I say that is because it turns into a production system where we see more Black male being incarcerated. Like one of my stats here, in the past 10 years, we've seen an increase of 70% of Black male being detained, while the whole population of Black male in Canada is only 3%. We're also seeing the same pattern where Indigenous people are being incarcerated at a 50% rate versus their counterpart white white population. And the makeup of the population is extremely so small that we start wondering what's going on, right? So having said that, how can we change it? How can we switch these events that are happening? And then also looking, when we're talking about judicial system, the penalty or the sentencing of Black people is worse and far harsh than anybody else. We are also looking at, for example, in the States, there was a Somalian police officer who accidentally shot a white woman, and he was sentenced to 12 to 13 years in prison, versus Ahmaud Berry, who was jogging and ended up dying just because these two individuals felt that he may fit in this box that we were talking about, where they believe that he's out there, he has no good intention, and they killed him, and it took almost 2 months in order for these people to be arrested. And we look again, not weeks later, George Floyd, the same thing. So the way we're sentencing, or we are punishing this crime, I'm not saying not to punish, let's punish, but let's punish to the same level, to the same understanding and standard. The next slide talks about, it's a video, but I will skip that video, but I'll invite you to go on your own and search how to stop Indigenous women from disappearing. It's a great TED Talks, and it invites us to look into we're all human beings, and every human being has a connection, whether with Mother Earth, whether with the people around us. So let's leverage all those connections that we have, because we're interconnected, to change the system. My next slide is on lateral violence. So I hear people asking, what about Black on Black crime? Black on Black crime, it doesn't, I'm not saying that that's not as important as police profiling. I'm not saying that that's less important as the injustice that we've been talking so far. But we have also to understand where the Black on Black crime is coming from. What's the root cause of it? Lateral violence stems from the way people in a position of powerlessness covertly or overtly direct their dissatisfaction, their frustration inward towards each other. It's a colonialism response where you want to identify as your colonizer and be better than the people who look the same as you. So as a result, we inflict the pain that we have internally, we inflict those pain to the people who look like us. But that is also as a result of oppression. It's a result of marginalization, powerlessness, continuous or ongoing racism and discrimination and prejudice that we experience. Okay. The next slide is on anti-racism around COVID. So not only we are experiencing the loss of people, but we are, like the racism that are showing up now, we are also in the midst of a pandemic season. So it's like a sandwich or a double sandwich, where in one hand you're dealing with COVID response and how to adjust your life around it, but also you're also dealing with this embedded racism that is woven within the fabric of our society. We pulled together a few stats on COVID-19, but also Jessica from Immigration Partnership Winnipeg, they have a anti-racism COVID-19 campaign that they're also hearing some of these things that I'll be sharing with you, that they're hearing people are being discriminated, people are experiencing oppression just because of who and what they look like. So since there have been an increase in racist incident, so far we have 138 incidents of COVID-19 related racism act, with 110 of those being reported in May, only May, 110. And if we break those down, 8 of those incidents was in Ontario, 36 in BC, 15 in Quebec. Of those reported experiencing racism, we have 80% were from East Asia, and 11% were from South Asia, 3% indigenous, 2% Black, and 4% described as others. The most type of harassment were verbal harassment, intentional spitting and coughing, and exclusion or refuse to access the premise. We've been hearing more and more of these incidents happening throughout, with either neighbors telling their neighbors to go back to China. I had my colleague here, who's one of the leadership team here, being told in a shop and a grocery store to go back to where she's coming from, and she's not even from China, she's from Philippines. So understanding those microaggression and discrimination that is not only impacting people during COVID-19, during a pandemic season, but also during their everyday life. Okay. The next slide, it talks about the impact of all of this on our mental health and our physical health. At times, targeted individuals may find themselves questioning whether, did this really happen to me? Or am I going crazy? Or am I dreaming about it? Because we don't also talk much about it. So, and in Canada, we don't acknowledge as often the wrong that we've done in the past, that we are a diverse, welcoming community, therefore is not really, it's almost diminishing the experience of those who have been racialized, who have been discriminated, who have been marginalized. So often the marginalized population or racialized population will go through this and start wondering, maybe it's me who's making it up in my head. So that compounded going back and forth, there's no proper healing. And then when there is healing, another incidents happen. When the incidents happen, you are constantly on a hypervigilant state or in a trauma state that you are not, your body, your mental health, your physical health has not had the time to recover before another incidents happen again. It's like living with a bear every day. The fear, the worry, the anger, all the feelings that people experience is constantly on the go, and there's no time to rest. So the compound grief, the pain that people experience leads to racial trauma. And when racial trauma happens, we also need to take care of ourselves and find ways how we can stop, how we can heal and continue. So despite the rise in racial microaggression, forms of racism continue to plague our system. Ethnic minority community and are constantly triggered and are constantly living on a trigger stress response. The next slide. So, we want to talk about how to talk about this. I am sorry these are so heavy topic, but we want to talk about how our children, or how do we talk about it to our children on the topic of racism. So I've heard people telling me, well, my child is so young, I don't want to talk about it because I want my children to see everybody as the same. Well, that's where we have a problem, because we are unique in our own ways. Whether we put skin color aside, we are all unique. So we can't lump everybody in a salad bowl and say we're all the same and we're equal. We are not. So some of these conversations can start as early as 3 years old, where you're talking to your children about the differences we all hold, whether it's through our beauty, through our ways of thinking, through our response in behavior. So children will start asking, like I have an example where a child asked their parents, "Mom, why does that child look dirty?" And the mom will shush the kid. Will say, "Shush, don't say that. That's not allowed." But we should instead say, you know what? They're not dirty. That's how they look, and they're beautiful in that color. The way we have our color in purple, the way our hair color in purple, in red, in gray. I love Lauren's hair color right now because it has a gray and purplish color. So all of that brings the uniqueness and the diversity that we hold as individuals. So instead of shushing that child, we should be telling them how beautiful it is to be different and how unique brings us together, right? So we can't be the same. We have to be different to some degree. You have to model empathy. Start buying books of children that have racialized children and read about it, discuss the emotional reaction, educational movies, sometimes depending on the age of your children, but also having some dolls or toys that are diverse, that are racialized, so that way your children can understand. One way to model empathy can be start talking about anti-Black racism. That if your child express concern about what they're seeing affecting another child or family, share how they can act in defense of that person. How can they stand up for that person? Discuss their emotional reactions. So for example, for older youth, talking about their emotional reaction to unfairness treatment. I hear it often where youth will share with us that they were put in a group, but at the end, I mean, the teacher would ask them to be in a group, but then they find themselves not being left out. So everybody have chosen their group clique or the group people, and that young boy was left out, and the teacher had to assign him a group. So how can a youth, or how can our team can stand up for that child, that other youth? How can they welcome them into their circle? Parent can also make good use of, when you're at home, use good use of movies or history, documentary to talk about it. The next slide. It talks about inclusive parents and anti-racist parents. So inclusive parents, we teach their kids that people matter more than their skin color. Make sure their child library is racially diverse. Share movies and show featuring people of color with their kids. Talks about privileges and what it means, what privilege means. Versus anti-racist parent, teach their kids that skin color deeply affect how people view us and how people treat us. Intentionally includes books that go beyond slavery, the civil rights movement. They use media to point out examples of racism and stereotype. They give their children contextual examples of their privilege, like being able to shop without being followed. Okay. Now, how to talk about race with your racialized children. That's very important, because like me, I have two boys who were born in Canada. One of them deeply believes that they're Canadian and holds all the privileges as white Canadian, their friend, which is not true. So we start talking about what that look like for him as he's growing. We start talking, building his self-esteem, but also self-worth. I don't want him to go into that message that he keeps hearing, that Black are bad, that Black end up being gangster. But instead, I told him, hey, you can be the next president. You can be anything you want to be, as long as we work hard for it, as long as you continue to keep that objective on the line. Build their self-esteem, teach them how to stand up for themselves. I've had to teach them that your skin color is Black, but not brown. So when other kids are teasing you and calling you brown, chocolate brown, remind them and correct them that actually, no, I am Black, I'm not brown. So understand those differences, teach them about the different dimension of racism and how it manifests. And I love this quote: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So if you can live with that and remind yourself of that quote all the time, that would be great. That would be another start. Jessica, next slide. So, model of ethnic identity. These are stages of how we build our identity as individuals. Stage one, we look at examining ethnic identity. So looking at exploring your own ethnicity, the you might be disinterested in doing so. Some minority students may initially accept the attitude of the dominant culture. Some may reject it. Attitude toward exploring an ethnic identity are influenced by several factors. So some of those several factors includes their ethnicity is a non-issue, which can lead to diffusion or foreclosure. Some individual may rely their strong view of ethnicity and appear in the stage 3, which we'll talk about it next. The next stage of ethnic identity search, the moratorium. Sometimes we may remain in stage 1 and we go back and forth. So it's a continuous search and continuous development until they encounter a situation that causes them to explore deeper. The situation may be harsh, overt racism, or it can be gradual, less traumatic. So this is a time of experimentation where we talk with friends and family and wonder what's going on. Why me? Why am I experiencing this? Wanting to learn more about your own culture, wanting to take courses about it, attend culture events. Maybe an emotional intense stage where the anger, the guilt, the embarrassment start coming up. And then an individual can remain in this stage for a little bit longer before they move on to stage 3, which is the final identity stage, where we resolve our identity conflict and accept membership into minority culture, but also open to other culture. The best outcome will be for individual to have a secure ethnic identity and positive orientation towards mainstream culture, and you become confident and calm. But I will take a step further to that, where youth who are racialized youth who are growing in Western countries, often, depending on how at home it's happening, they carry 2 identities all the time. I have to please my parents and follow the traditional beliefs and practices, while that at school, I have to hold a different identity so I can be accepted into my friends group. So I can be accepted into the mainstream, the cool, mainstream welcoming kid. So we have also to be mindful of racialized kid, that they might be going back and forth within that identity internally. And that can also cause some mental health, some trauma, if we're not handling it properly. And then also starting to unpack the trauma that people may have experienced throughout their life. Having these difficult conversation, we need to start talking about radical responsibility for our action, implementing healthy routine, setting and enforcing boundary, and when we're safe enough, unpacking the trauma. And that's where the healing will start. So I think the next stage, I will pass it on to Lauren, my colleague, who will take you on to a specific action that we can do.
All right, great. Thank you, Nina. Thank you. I'm gonna take this off. So Zoom. Okay, so we're going to have a bit of a conversation now around moving forward and how we can act. This information is coming a bit from a perspective of bystanders and those. I know many of us stated that we didn't really experience racism personally, but we have witnessed racism and kind of what we can do. I encourage everyone, if you're looking for more information on how to be an ally, please attend our next webinar, and I can hopefully promise, or hopefully semi-guarantee that hopefully we won't have as many technical issues in the next webinar on the 25th, I believe it is, at the same time, and that's where we'll discuss further in-depth allyship and what it means to be an ally and how we can do that. But this is more of a quick overview. So, sorry, Jessica, if you can just keep clicking for me till I get all the information. So I know many of us may be witnessing acts of discrimination or racism or harassment that we are seeing, and it's good for us at this stage to be angry, and I'm happy to hear that people are struggling and that people are, well, not struggling, but that people are angry and upset about what is happening and is struggling with what is going on in the world. That anger is really good, but before we enter into situations where we want to use our anger, and we might if we see it on the street, or we see it in a store, someone that is racially profiling somebody else, we need to ensure that there's safety for everyone before we respond. Take that anger and fuel it and use it, but use it after everyone is safe. So make sure that we, in that moment, if we're witnessing it, focus on de-escalation and ensuring that everybody is safe. Looking at exit routes. Are there ways that we can support people in getting out? What does that look like? We need to be aware, particularly as allies or the bystanders that are witnessing it, to be aware that our choices of interventions may have impact on the persons involved, particularly the person that is experiencing the racism. It's entirely possible that by getting involved without ensuring everyone's safety, that we can escalate the violence and have that be worse. And there are going to be occasions where people may not want our support. And as allies, we need to be okay with that. There tends to be, which we'll talk more in the allyship slide, our allyship webinar, we'll talk a bit more about the concept of white saviorness, or this need to rescue. And sometimes that's not our place to be rescuing because we may be silencing people's voices. A story that I'm going to share in the next webinar, but that I'll share with you guys really quick, was a previous co-worker of mine used to work at a casino and was a manager there, and he noticed that one of his Indigenous employees was being harassed by a group of customers. So he got quite upset and hobbled out there and said that they don't stand for that, that's not okay, and kicked everybody out, and came back looking all proud to that point when his Indigenous employee looked at him and said, "I can speak for myself, you know." And so that can be a way that we are actually silencing people's voices that need to come out. So it's best if we're seeing these situations to instead ask the person that's experiencing the racism what we can do to help. How can I help you? I'm seeing what's happening. Is there anything you need from me? Is there anything I can do to help this situation? And be okay if they say no, because they may say no and may not want that type of support. And we have to be okay with saying, okay, well, if you do need, I'm over here. I'm off to the side. Right, so, and continue to assess that situation and continue to engage with the person that may be targeted, continuing to ask, are you sure, like, I'm still here if you need, but really respect that fact that they may not want our support. And then if they say, yes, I need your help, can you, pretend to be a friend of mine and get me out of here? Can you, whatever it may be, can you videotape what's happening? Can you stand to the side? Then doing those types of things can be really helpful. And it's really about empowering the individual that is being targeted to be able to speak and stand up on their own. Do not engage with the individual that is promoting the racism or is the attacker. Again, we don't want the situation to escalate and there to be more violence, and then continue to monitor. Really what we can do because you're going to feel angry and you're going to be upset that this is happening, and what we want people to do, rather than in those moments where the situation could become escalated, take that anger and fuel it to talk to your friends and families and coworkers about what's happening in the world and the notion of anti-racism and how we can help. Speak up on the injustices, contact your MLAs, push for changes. And really, we need to also be sure to never stop educating ourselves and being aware that regardless of who we are, regardless of what experience we have, we all come from a place where we have our own stereotypes, our own biases, and our own belief systems about things. And they can sneak up on us in ways that we don't expect. The other story I share about ways that this can sneak up on us is I've got a lot of experience working with the Nehiyaw community. And one time I was very excited to go and speak with an elder, Dr. Liana Makokis, and I was going to go ask her some questions that I had regarding this. I was in school at the time, so regarding a presentation I was doing, and I was very excited to meet this woman that I thought was really important in the community. And so I got myself all dressed up in my little white way that I do, with the little put on my heels, wore my fancy suit, got myself ready to go. And decided to go forward and go and meet her. And so as I went to go meet her, where she works is at Blue Quills College. So I went to Blue Quills College, which is a residential school, which has been taken over by the community. So as we are walking through the residential school, and I realized the person that was with me actually looked at me and said, "What are you wearing?" And I said, "What? What's wrong?" They look at me and go, "The nuns wore heels." And so I didn't realize the clicking of my heels down those hallways could re-traumatize people that work there, that had been at that school as students. So those are ways that my westernized lens was blinded, and that actually could hurt someone. So being very aware, always monitoring ourselves, and always working to educate ourselves, and recognize that just because we have biases doesn't mean that we can't support and change those biases and work to being better people. And it doesn't mean that we don't care. It just, we live in a society where where these stereotypes and these belief systems are deeply ingrained. So we need to be willing to acknowledge it, and acknowledge the fact that none of us are perfect when it comes to this. Do we want to move to the next slide? So the next slide is a video. Again, since we're having some issues with videos, we won't be playing it. It's called Cracking the Code. And I really recommend people to be able to go and check it out.
So Lauren, I think I can get it up.
Oh, okay. All right. I will come on.
So just bear with me here. Okay, actually just one more second. Lauren, is it okay if I play?
Yes, absolutely.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. "Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today?" They're just chatting up, and says, "Yeah." So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, "I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID." At which point my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, "Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us?" Right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women. Right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks. at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, "Excuse me, why are you doing this?" And the checker goes, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that?" She goes, "Well, this is our policy." She goes, "No, it's not your policy, because you didn't do that with me." "Oh, well, I know you've been." She goes, No, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the two white elderly ladies go, "Oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. And it's totally unacceptable." At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, "Is there a problem here?" And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, "Yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened." So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, "This is unfair. Why are you doing this to me?" Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So as we saw in the video, that is an example of a way in which we can be allies in the way that we can. And the way that we can utilize potentially our own privilege to assist others and to help others. Again, it's important to balance this with the rescuing and running in. One example I always use when I talk about this kind of stuff is my stepfather, who works very closely with Dr. Leona Makokis. And what will happen is often they will go to meetings and Leona will speak first. And she will always speak what needs to be said, and Ralph will stand as backup. And then as soon as, and this has happened in several meetings, where they won't hear Leona because she's an Indigenous woman, and my stepfather is a very large, redneck-looking farmer kind of guy who's in social work. It's very weird. But he will stand behind her and they won't hear Leona. And so Leona will say, "Ralph, speak." And that's Ralph's cue, that it's his turn to say what needs to be said because it's heard differently from him as a white male. And so these are ways of supporting those within our community that to have their voice without to take that voice for them, even though our intentions may be good. So we're going to move on to the next slide. So we have here a list of some different resources, some movies that you can watch, some books that you may be able to read, and some podcasts and things like that that you'd be able to listen to help and continue to educate yourselves as well as those around you, and encouraging others to participate with you and listen, watching as a family, those types of things. So these are just a list of different ones that exist. So we'll move on again. So we really, we always want to encourage and provide some resources for individuals that may be struggling. Elmwood Community Resource Centre here in Winnipeg does provide individual as well as group-based counseling available at no cost. So if individuals that you're aware of are struggling with what is happening and are requiring some additional support, that is an option. We also do as much advocacy as we can on behalf of our clients and those that need that. You can also file complaints at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. in order to do that, as well as please feel free to access our website where there's many different resources, including a anti-racist framework for the workplace that people can access and take a look at. So these are just some of the resources that exist out there. It's really, sorry, we'll move on to the next slide. So, I mean, a big piece of as we move forward is what are we going to do and how are we going to commit to change? It's really important that we make sure that what's happening doesn't become a hashtag which then fades once it no longer becomes the hot button issue. We want this to continue and to move forward beyond to real, actual systemic change for individuals and for those within our community. These are some questions that I know I myself have asked myself and that I continue and encourage people to think about as they move forward. And that what we do. So it can be questions around, do I stay silent when I hear racist comments, see racial injustice, have an opportunity to stand up for a person of color because I'm afraid of how it will be perceived by white people? Am I worried if I spoke up, it might negatively affect my friendships, my jobs, my relationship with family who maybe hold different belief systems? What's keeping me silent? What's keeping me from moving forward and being aware of that? Do I say things that and attempt to shift the focus away from race because I want to be less controversial or I want it to be a more comfortable conversation? I'm afraid of going there. I'm afraid of what that means. And another question can be, do I condemn the actions taken by other individuals and by those that are angry without acknowledging the validity of their pain and doing anything constructive to support their cause? So when we're looking at individuals that may be looting, and our first gut reaction may be to say, well, looting doesn't help anything. Where is that coming from? And are we actually doing anything other than that to continue the change? It's really important to remember, and what I've said to a few people is that the race for racial equality is a marathon, it is not a sprint. And so this is something that we have developed over since the beginnings of Canada and the beginning process of colonization. This has begun. So it's going to take a while to undo it, but there is a lot that we can do to help move that forward and push that forward. And a big part of that is taking care of ourselves and looking at our own biases, our own beliefs, and where did those come from, and pushing for real change. We're going to move to the next slide. If you feel the urge to do something in these difficult times with the grief and anger that you may be feeling, please channel this anger into actions. Don't let it fade away. It's really important to remember that the status quo remains because we pass off the responsibility to others rather than taking on that responsibility to ourselves. It can be as simple as writing to the MLA, asking for change, pushing for that, voting for individuals that support anti-racist movements and pushing that forward. It can also be as simple as if you're in a workplace and you see something. I know there was an occasion in one of my previous workplaces where I wasn't comfortable with what was happening, and I said straight up, you can do this, but I'm not going to support it. I won't be the one that does this. I have to step. And I didn't necessarily have to leave the job, but I had to make that known and state that I wouldn't be present at that table. So there are little things that we can do. Indigenous people and racialized communities are constantly worried about their child or their loved one that isn't going to be treated the same way as a white person and won't be treated by police properly, or worse, might not come home because of racially motivated interactions, and being very aware that that reality exists for others, even if it doesn't exist for ourselves, and being very, very cautious about what that means for our end for others.